In this video, we're looking at Year 12 HSC Economics, Globalization and Economic Development, and in particular we're looking at why development differs between nations, why economic development is different between different countries. In terms of the syllabus, we're looking at this dot point here, the reasons for differences between nations. So if we look at why economic development differs between nations, we've got global factors, which will be part 1, this video, and then there are domestic factors, which will be part 2, which will be the next video. In terms of global factors, we look at these three things: global trade flows, global investment flows, and the limited foreign aid flows. In terms of domestic factors, we look at the disparate or unequal access each country has to economic resources, and also institutional factors such as the strength of governments in these nations. So we'll be focusing on global factors in this video. So the first global factor relates to global trade flows. So wealthy countries significantly protect their own agriculture sectors and they lock out developing nations. Now this can be through paying subsidies to their own producers, and it can also be imposing trade barriers such as tariffs on agriculture from other countries. In terms of subsidizing and really helping local farmers, the European Union's Common Agricultural Policy, this CAP here that's been referred to, is a strong example of that. So the other point is that due to the difficulty of signing global trade agreements, the world has seen a rise in regional and bilateral agreements, primarily between developed nations, and that's excluded developing nations. So the trade is being diverted away from developing nations to stick in between those developed or even developed and emerging nations. The other point here is that global efforts to include developing nations in world trade have stalled. Think about the WTO's Doha round and the limited success that had in trying to include developing nations more in trade. So the overall impact? Well, economic development is going to be different between nations because the gains from trade are concentrated among developed nations. And this leads to greater inequality. So the second global factor about why economic development differs between nations is about global financial flows, the movement of money. So true, developing countries have received a greater share of global investment flows. It used to be that developed nations got the majority, but developing nations are getting more of a share. However, among those developing nations, there are great disparities. So investors, in terms of placing their money, have favoured faster growing nations such as the BRIC nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and have steered clear, avoided the least developed countries in the world, particularly some of those sub-Saharan African economies. So the overall impact? Well, while developing nations have boosted their share of global financial flows overall, the emerging nations have been the big winners, and they have gained much more than those developing economies. Okay, here's the final global factor in terms of why economic development is different between nations, and this relates to limited foreign aid flows. So high-income economies, our advanced economies, traditionally contribute minimal amounts of GDP towards foreign aid for developing nations. Now, minimal might seem a bit harsh, but it is a relatively low contribution in terms of their overall GDP. Critics also say that when foreign aid is given, it might not actually improve the lives of the poor. This is what's known as phantom aid. So the money goes through, but it's kind of going to the wrong areas, or people are corrupt and taking that money. Another criticism is that this foreign aid must be spent on projects that are not always in the best interests of the country. And this is called tied aid, where the foreign aid is tied or locked to a particular purpose. So the overall impact, If foreign aid is limited and/or ineffective, it will not help to reduce inequalities between nations. Rather, it could exacerbate those existing inequalities.